All right. So, sorry if the lights were off in here. I guess I'll have to get here a little bit early. Usually I have everything kind of set to release. So the lights are ever off, the door's not locked. Come on in. If I'm not here, if you guys want lights, there's a little white box over there, and there's a little white box over there. Just push the button. So we'll kind of jump into things here today. A couple things I want to mention off the top. So the first is it's not for any points, but it helps me out kind of get these CL sessions organized. So I've heard back from most of the undergraduates who are leading them. So I'm trying to get these finalized, but it helps me a little bit to know like what you guys kind of plan to attend, kind of what times would be like the most days and times would be the most traffic. So I've got a poll up here. If you could try to fill it out by the end of the day tomorrow, it just gives me some data, a better idea of kind of how to get things organized for next week when those CL sessions start. Okay. So they don't start till next Thursday. So I'll make sure I'll be able to mention them next week as well. We're just trying to get things set up so that we've got them kind of all ready to go. So you might see, I'll probably put up a current document of what those daytime and locations look like. Once it's finalized, I'll just replace that document. Okay. So once again, you can attend any one of those sessions each week. And I think I misspoke last class. Each one is worth 0.15% or 1.5 points out of the total thousands class. So if you attend, I can guarantee there will be 10 of them. So it's a total points of 1.5% added to your grade. Usually around finals time, because of their availability, they're not all available, but I can usually get most of the CL leaders to have some. So usually we can get 12 total in the year, which means you can actually get 1.8. I won't promise that, but I can promise you there are 1.5%, points that are available there. Okay. Is there any questions about those before we kind of move? Okay. The next thing I just want to mention, I've got, understand there's some weird things going on with this first week. So that module 1 reading was just to give you access to the first chapter of the book. It looks like an assignment. I have to have it set as an assignment. So when you click on that link, it can auto sync up the Top Hat. So what I mentioned on Tuesday, there were some issues with Top Hat, right? I reached out to the book rep. Apparently there was a hold on all of my courses and they don't know why. So hopefully that was resolved yesterday. So if you haven't already, all you should have to do is click on this module 1 basic economics link. That should then kind of push you to Top Hat. That's where you'll use that join code. I put in an announcement on Canvas, but it's also in the syllabus, also in the first week slides. Once you get that entered in and you kind of register with your IU credentials, it then should automatically sync it up to Canvas. Okay. So I apologize for that. And I shouldn't apologize. It wasn't my error, but I didn't know there was a hold on my accounts. Okay. So that's the next thing I wanted to mention. Now, this first one, it looks like it's worth points because I have to make an assignment. It has to have some points attached to it. After next week, I've moved this. I'll show you the assignments tab. I move it into a category that's not being weighted or counted towards your grade. Right? So this first one isn't worth any points. The first module reading that you will have to do is this one that will now show up on Canvas. Okay. So the module 2 reading, we always do the readings prior to us covering the material in class. So next week we'll start module 2. In fact, if we have a little bit of time, I'll start it today. This has to be completed by the end of the day, Monday, the day prior to us covering it in class. It's due at the end of the day. I said there's a little discrepancy here. It's technically due at 11:50 instead of 11:59. So it gives Top Hat and Canvas time to sync up and it doesn't treat all of your assignments as late. Because what happens to late assignments in this class? They are worth 0 points. You don't want to see zeros pop up in the grade book, right? So there's that little bit of buffer time. So that you're responsible for having that complete by the end of the day next Monday. After class today, you will also see this first, sorry, I said after class. I have 2 sections. And to be fair, I don't release it until after the second section. So around 12:30 today, you will see that first kind of quiz pop up. It'll simply be over a lot of the stuff we talked about Tuesday on the syllabus and then whatever we cover today. So module 1 and syllabus questions, that'll be due at the end of the day, Monday as well. And so you have those 2 module reading assignment and a quiz that are both due at the end of the day next Monday. Okay. I think that should cover all the housekeeping stuff before we jump into material. Are there any other questions for me before we get started? I said any other. Are there questions for me before we get started? Okay. All right. So we will jump back into these, where are they at? PowerPoint slides for this first week. I think we left off here thinking about, oops, not what I wanted to do. Thinking about opportunity cost. All right, so we said when people face scarce resources, anytime I do something with my time or my money, right, I'm not doing something else with that time block or with that dollars that I spent. Okay. So we said what I'm giving up, that's my opportunity cost. So we'll dive a little bit deeper into this, think about some scenarios where we can start to think about what these opportunity costs look like. Okay. So let's assume I'm thinking about getting an apartment. If you haven't already, the way that the rental market works in Bloomington, if you plan to be here next year, which hopefully all of you do, right, you might want to start looking very soon, right? Because it moves quick. So let's say you're thinking about getting an apartment, and here's the monthly rental rate. Which of these apartments would you want to choose? The one that has the lowest rent. Let's assume that they have all the exact same amenities, the exact same square footage, same number of roommates, same number of shared bathrooms, right? All of these things are the same. You'd want the one that has the lowest cost. But what haven't we factored in? There might be an opportunity cost associated with selecting one of these apartments. So let's think about what if they're different distances from campus? We change this variable. Well, if I think about each of these apartments, apartment A, the rent is higher, it's closer to campus, and so on and so forth. Well, if I'm losing this time when I'm walking to and from this apartment, which apartment starts to become a little bit more attractive? The one that's closer to campus. But I don't know what the total cost is yet. I know the rental cost. We typically say this is like an explicit cost. I'll kind of introduce this language a little bit later on in the semester, but I might accidentally slip into it today. This is essentially the amount of money you have to hand over to rent this apartment. But we also want to factor into this total cost the opportunity cost of living there. Part of the opportunity cost is, what could I be doing with all this time I'm losing walking to and from class? Now, this might seem like an odd example because I can't work during that time. It's too short of a time block. But think about it, instead of walking, I could be, I don't know, playing video games in my apartment for an extra 5 minutes or whatever it is. So inherently, we know that the one that's closer to campus is going to be more attractive. But why? Because of the cost associated with it. So let's think about this. Where I came up with this number, let's just assume that I can value your time. I know that every hour in your day, you value at $10. You would pay $10 to get an additional hour in your day. If that's the case, we could then look at these apartments and the amount of time I lose each month walking to and from campus, every hour is worth $10. I could calculate the total monthly cost that it's taking me to walk to and from campus. So each one of these apartments, my opportunity cost, what I'm giving up, the time I'm giving up, if I value every hour at $10, here would be kind of the associated opportunity cost of selecting each one of those apartments. Any questions on that idea? Okay, so we now have the opportunity cost of selecting each one of these apartments. What's the total cost? Well, it's rent, that explicit cost, plus what I'm giving up, that opportunity cost. Right? I want to be factoring both of these in to make a self-interested, rational decision. So I take the rent, I add up, and add to it the opportunity cost, and I can get the total cost of living in each apartment. And once again, these are monthly rates. So if I look at now, once I factored in the opportunity cost, which apartment is the most attractive? B has the lowest total cost once I factor in these opportunity costs. So this is just like a simple example that just goes to show my decision. If I don't factor in my opportunity cost, I would have actually made myself worse off. I would have chose something that actually had a higher total cost. So we don't want to do that, right? We want to make sure we're factoring in the opportunity cost when we're making decisions. Now, I'm going to start today with a lot of individual kind of thought experiments, but firms do the same thing, right? They can think about, okay, I could make this amount of profit producing this good, but if I have a production facility and I can produce either shirts or pants, right, textiles, well, if I can make money, I can turn a profit producing pants, but I could have had a higher profit producing shirts. What's a very high opportunity cost? I want to factor that in. I would then switch my production. Just like here, we chose a certain apartment based off of the rent, profits, adding an opportunity cost, I changed my decision. Okay. So once again, I'll start out things like a lot of like individual or what we call consumer decisions, but a lot of this would apply, not a lot, all of this would apply to firms as well. Okay. So what if instead of $10, I valued every hour of my day at 20? What apartment is going to start to become, you don't have to give me an A, B, or C if you can't remember, which apartment is going to become more attractive? And the closest. If I value my time more, then when I'm giving up more time, that's more costly to me. It's raising the opportunity cost, which then consequently raises the total cost. So that apartment becomes less attractive to me. So if we went through the calculations, we can determine our new opportunity cost values of every single apartment. We can then update our total cost values. Lo and behold, which apartment now becomes the most attractive? Apartment A, right? The closest to campus. So when we're making decisions, we don't make it just off the opportunity cost or just off this explicit cost, like how much money I'm handing over to either rent the apartment or to buy a certain good. I make it based off of the total cost, which factors both of those in. Okay. Any questions before we kind of change this example? Okay. So, and just to be, I don't know, dive into this and make it a little more nuanced and probably won't push it as far in a question, but I'm giving you these values of like $10 and $20. What could be true is that this isn't going to be the case for every individual. Everybody values their time differently, right? So if I don't value my time very much, I might be more likely to choose that apartment further from campus because my opportunity cost is going to be lower. Some other individual, based off their preferences, whether or not they have a job they could work, right? They might value their time more. That's going to change their decision. So when we look at this, these are like simple examples, but it could change for every individual. So let's instead, dive into the next idea, which is, okay, we can calculate these total costs. We're going to start talking about marginal costs. Whatever that was, I thought it was my phone, so you tripped me out. So if I ever have like, I'm thinking about marginal, what does the word marginal mean? Change, right? Or the difference in my costs, right? So marginal costs are if I change my decision, how much did my cost change by? So if I think about here, if I move apartments, let's assume I'm currently in apartment, I didn't give it a number, but apartment 1, right? So the current total cost, factoring in both my rent and my opportunity or commuting cost, is $1,120. Now here, I kept rent the same just to kind of simplify the example. So let's say I'm currently in that apartment. I then moved to apartment 2. What was the change in my cost there? It went up by $120. That's my marginal cost. What if I'm in my current apartment and I instead moved to apartment 3? What was the change in my cost? It went up by $240. So I can calculate these marginal costs by when I change my decision, how much did my total costs change by? If I think about a firm, if I want to produce more units, what do I have to do? Hire more workers. That's going to increase my cost. What was my marginal cost there? Well, whatever the change in output was, the change in cost that I incurred in my business, my firm. Okay. So this is kind of the idea of marginal cost. What if I then start to think about what's the marginal cost of studying an additional hours? However much I value my time, right? Maybe it's how much money I could be making if I had that hour and was able to work a job. I would have my hourly wage. Isn't that like you can't work an hour, you can tutor for an hour, right? There are jobs where you can definitely work like in hour increments. And so our marginal cost is when I choose to do something, when I choose to study an additional hour, what am I not doing? Right? Or if I choose to play video games, what am I not doing? Right? That change in my cost, that's my margin. What if I instead think about driving? Well, I would have to factor in my time, but what's another main cost that would factor into my total cost when I drive? That's gas. We can make this much more complex. I could factor in the depreciation of my car and insurance, right? Here, we're just thinking about that marginal cost at a very simplistic level is my time, but also the amount of money I have to hand over for this, which is gas. Gas. Now, this dives a little bit deeper into concepts we'll talk about, not for, another 6 weeks or so. But I had someone in my section, I have sections on Wednesday as well. What about insurance? If I have to pay for car insurance and I have to buy it for the next year, well, if I choose to drive another 50 miles, how would that insurance factor into my marginal costs? Well, if I drive 50 miles or I drive 100, so if I've already paid for the insurance, it doesn't matter what I do in the next year, right? I've already paid for it. So if I choose to drive 50 miles or 100, what is my marginal cost just from insurance? So if I drive 50 miles, how much do I pay for insurance? $600. If I drive 100 miles, how much am I still paying for my insurance? So what's my marginal cost? No. So there's going to be some costs that get factored into our total cost that won't impact our marginal cost. Some of them do, some of them won't. In this class, we won't kind of go too deep into that yet, but I wanted to mention it here so we can start thinking about what this term of marginal costs actually means. It's the change in my cost from whatever decision I'm making. So with this idea of marginal cost, we're then going to start to think about marginal benefits, right? Because if I'm choosing to do something, what did I do with those other apartments? I held constant all the other amenities, right? So how much value would I get? I was kind of holding that constant here. But we can think about every time we do something, there's not only an additional cost, there's an additional benefit. So yes, when I use my money to buy a certain good, there's a cost to that. Total cost would be the amount of money I handed over plus the opportunity cost. What could I have done with that money? But why did I buy that good? Because I really liked it. It brought me an additional benefit to my life. So what we want to do when we're making decisions is we want to weigh out these marginal benefits and these marginal costs. So just to kind of go through a couple examples with marginal benefits, what would the marginal benefits be if you accept a job offer? Whatever the salary is, right? I go from making nothing to making a certain amount of money. Right? You're thinking about once you get out of college. Now, if I already have a job and I take one that pays higher, how would I find my marginal benefit? Yeah, take the difference between those salaries. Now, we could complicate this because when I work a certain job, what matters other than just how much I'm getting paid? Do I like the job? Right? Maybe insurance I could factor in or some of these other factors, but I'm choosing this one because that's a lot harder to measure, right? So even if I can make the same amount of money between two jobs, why might I choose one over the other? Because I don't want to sit behind a desk all day crunching numbers. I enjoy talking with people younger than me that can give me new insights into what's happening and thinking about economics. That's my example. I like teaching a lot more than I would like being stuck behind a desk. So even if I can make the same amount of money, that marginal benefit could be how much I enjoy that activity. That's really hard to measure. But I still make decisions based off of that. And no one probably knows how much I value doing something other than myself. There's ways we try to measure this in data, but that's a different class. Okay. What if I work an additional hour? I typically think about the marginal benefit is whatever my hourly wage rate is, right? What if I'm a firm? If I sell one more gallon of gas, what's the marginal benefit? I sell something, the benefit is how much money someone pays me, right? My revenues, right? Or my marginal revenues, okay? What if, and I've already went through this one, I choose a certain job, it's not just salary, it's my enjoyment from that activity. Now, this is an interesting one. There's actually a study that was out there, and they forget what city it was, but they took like apartment complexes that like it's cookie cutter room. Every room looks the same. Every room looks the same. And one side was facing another building, and the other side had a better view. So I was going to give the example. I was from down here in Michigan, right on the lake, and this occurs there all the time. If you have a house, right, or an apartment complex, the rooms on the side that face away from the lake, what do you think is true about those relative to the ones facing it? They're a lot cheaper. Why? Because people value that view. It brings them enjoyment or it increases their marginal benefit. So people make decisions based off of these marginal benefits and marginal costs. Now, I'll also give this additional example because there's one thing we want to think about with marginal benefits, and then we'll kind of come back to marginal costs. There's a similar concept. So next week, got a mobile lawn, and it's supposed to be like 90 every day, right? I'm going to get done mowing the lawn. And the thing that sounds best to me is just cracking open a cold beer out in my garage fridge, right? That's going to bring me a high marginal benefit once I'm done mowing the lawn, right? So that marginal benefit is relatively high from that first beer I consume. Now, kind of already cooled down a little bit, got a nice little buzz going. I said, okay, I'm going to have a second beer. Now, that's going to bring me a marginal benefit, but it's not near as high as that first, right? I've already had one that kind of cooled down a little bit. That second one, my marginal benefit won't be quite as high. Now, if I continue, right, at some point, I become inefficient around the house. My wife is yelling at me. That marginal benefit starts to decline. So typically with marginal benefits, when you think about as I do more of something, as I buy more of something, that marginal benefit is going down. You can think about this as if I go out and buy one computer, laptop, that is a huge benefit to me as a college student. But what if I buy a second one? I only use one at a time. What's happened to that marginal benefit? It's fallen a lot. Now, it doesn't always fall that quickly for different types of goods, but that's generally the concept we think about. We have marginal benefits. As I buy more of something, it's declining. Okay? If you think about this for firms, you might think, well, the price is constant, right? So I'm making the same amount on every unit. That could be the case, but who am I going to sell to first? The person who's going to pay the highest price. What might I then do? Well, if I can identify consumer characteristics, I might send certain people ads where they can actually pay a little bit lower, right? So typically, even with firms, when they're selling products, we see that the marginal benefit is also decreasing. Now, it might be like a step function where it's constant, goes down, constant, but the general direction is that it's decreasing. So we have declining marginal benefits, or what we call diminishing marginal benefits. So all the examples I'll use, you'll kind of start to see as that quantity of something goes up, the marginal benefit is declining. So this is where, there we go. Let me just pop this light on here real quick. When we think about how are people making decisions, right, what we're going to assume is that anytime I choose to do something, the marginal benefit, yes, we're doing red here today, the marginal benefit of that activity, well, why would I do it? If it brings me additional benefits that are greater than the additional cost, so marginal benefits being higher than marginal cost, you can almost think about it as my net benefits there are positive. I'm better off, right? So I would choose to do that. Well, what if the marginal benefits become less than the marginal costs? Well, now the additional value this is bringing to me in terms of the benefit, it's lower than those costs. You can think about it here. My net benefits are less than zero. I don't want to do that activity, or I don't want to purchase that good. You can think about this as for firms. What is a firm's marginal benefit? Kind of my marginal revenues. However much money I'm making by selling this good. Well, if that is greater than my marginal cost to produce that good, I want to produce it. If that's not the case, someone's paying me $5 for this product and I had to spend 10 to make it. Do I want to produce that? No, right? So firms and individuals make decisions based off of whether that marginal benefit is greater than that marginal cost. See if I got any black marker here. Get that one. Say that again. So we won't quite go into that here, but what would be maximized is my total benefit, right? My total benefit would be maximized there. I won't dive into that yet, but yes, you're kind of thinking about the next step. Yeah. So the units here are going to be however much, whatever I would value that time at. So if I could put a dollar amount to it. So when we get to later modules, we'll think about something called utility. It's a different measure of the marginal benefit. But for right now, you can think about this as if I could value how much enjoyment or happiness this is bringing me, this is the dollar amount I would put to it. Any other questions before we keep moving? Yeah.
Is there a term for the marginal benefit becomes are they opposite of each other?
When that sign flips?
Yeah.
Not necessarily. There's not one term we'll use. Generally, think about that as like the net benefits are just going from positive to being negative. Yep. Yeah.
Being partial revenue, full marginal cost.
Yeah. So a lot of things in economics, the answer is it depends. So when they're equal, what would my net benefits be? Am I any better off? Am I any worse off? So we don't know. Right? I could buy it, I'm no better off. I could not buy it, I'm better off. So we always kind of think about, we always assume that people will go up to that point where they're equal. At that equality, we don't necessarily know. Yeah, it's a good question. There's no good or bad questions. Kind of thinking ahead. Yep. So yeah, when we talked about marginal cost, when we were doing this for the apartments, what did we factor in? Both rent and the opportunity cost. So this is the change in my total cost. Yep. Any other questions before we keep moving here? All right. So the next thing I want to think about is kind of related to that maximum idea. So let's say I've got the total benefits from choosing to do something are 1,000, and the total costs are 1,500. Okay. If I think about kind of what would my net benefit be here, or like in the firm's case, we can think about this as like profits, right? What would the difference between these two values be? Negative 500, right? My marginal benefits, how much it's benefiting me minus my costs, are actually negative here. Now, that doesn't mean I will necessarily kind of just shut down completely if I'm a firm, or I won't do this, because we can think about, what if my marginal benefits, right, are 100 from increasing that activity, or increasing how much I'm buying, increasing how much I'm producing by 1 unit. Right? Well, if the marginal benefits of buying or selling that good are 100, but the marginal costs are 50, what would my new total benefits and my new total cost be? Well, marginal is how much my total benefits are changing by. So my new total benefits would be what? 1,100. What are my new margin, or sorry, what are my new total costs? Well, if my costs are going up by 50, 1,550. What are my new net benefits? If I take the difference between these two values, negative 450. If I'm a firm, losing $500 better than losing 450? Yes. So I would produce that next unit. So even though my total net benefit might be negative, that doesn't mean I stop production. I might be able to reduce that negative value by continuing to produce a little bit more. So we want to make sure we don't make decisions based off of the total benefit and total cost. We make decisions based off of marginal benefits and marginal costs. And this is kind of a little example that shows why. If I continue to produce or buy this good, I'm getting that net benefit to be closer to zero. It's going, technically, it's increasing, right? The smaller negative value. So this is easier, I think, when these values are positive. I just wanted to use an example here to show you it could be the values, the difference between total benefits and total cost is negative. Well, there I still choose to increase how much I'm buying, increase how much I'm producing, as long as the difference between my marginal benefits and my marginal costs are positive. Okay? That marginal benefit is greater than my marginal cost. Any questions on this idea before I show you a graph and kind of give this a little bit more continuity? Okay. So I already alluded to this idea that marginal benefits are decreasing, right? So if I'm thinking about, there it is. If I'm thinking about graphing this out, and I could think about this as the quantity I'm producing as a firm or the quantity I'm buying as an individual. If I'm thinking about my marginal benefits, to the point earlier, if I could measure this in dollars, I would expect that as I buy more or produce more, the marginal benefit is declining. Now, what's going to happen to marginal costs? So if I think about a firm, or if I think about if I choose to do something like with my time, what hour am I going to give up first? The ones cheapest, which means the one that has the lowest opportunity cost, right? The hour I don't care about. But what about the second hour I give up? I'm going to have to choose the thing I value the next lowest. So what's happening to my cost there? My opportunity costs are increasing. So my marginal costs from doing something are going to be increasing. If I put this in the context of a firm, who am I going to hire first? The most productive worker. So there, I'm paying a worker, let's say minimum wage, they're producing 100 units. I can figure out my per unit cost. Well, who do I hire second? The next most efficient worker, I pay them minimum wage, they're only able to produce 20 units. So as I increase the number of work, I'm hiring less and less efficient workers, so my cost per unit are going up. So if we think about that, what's happening in this range? Right? Well, there, my marginal benefits are greater than my marginal cost, right? At these quantities, that marginal benefit is greater than my marginal cost. So do I want to buy that good or do I want to produce that good? Yeah, right? So I think about here, really what's happening are my net kind of marginal benefits are positive, right? So I choose to kind of continue to buy this good or produce this good. Now, what about over in this range? Well, at all of these quantities, my marginal benefits are now less than my marginal costs. The net benefits are now negative. So if we think about this in the context of a firm, I want to produce these units. I do not want to produce these higher quantities, right? So the question earlier, where do we think of this as stopping? I didn't leave myself a lot of room here. But this would be the point where we stop our production or we stop how much we're buying, we stop our consumption. We want to put this like in an individual context. Any questions on this idea before we keep moving here? Okay. So just to reiterate a point, this is not captured in these Zoom recordings that I put on YouTube. So anything I do up here in the dot cam, you should definitely be taking notes on, right? Because this is stuff you won't be able to go back and review unless you've written it down. Okay. This is what this will typically look like. I'll then kind of hop back to the slides. If you're looking at the slides in advance of that week, so I'll get the module 2 slides. Actually, I already have them on Canvas, but typically I'll kind of post them after our Thursday class for the next module. If you review those before we cover them, you'll see these blank slides. That's likely where I'm going to be doing some work on the dot page. Okay. So any other questions before we kind of move on here a little bit? All right. So we're going to switch gears a little bit here. So some of this is, you'll see questions pop up on this first quiz, but hopefully these are some like easier, kind of more like definition questions. If you look back at these slides, it should be a little bit more kind of straightforward. So we make a differentiation between two types of statements in economics, right? So we've got positive statements. This is what people are actually doing. You could think about this as when we look at the data, this is what we see, the decisions that people are actually making. We hope they're self-interested and rational, right? But this is what people are actually doing. We call these positive statements. So I might go out, look at some data, I look at individuals' incomes, how much they're saving, and I can see that on average, they're saving 5% of their income. The positive statement, what they are doing. Now, if I have an economic model that says how much money do people need to save to retire at 65, then maybe my model says you actually need to save more than 5%. This is a normative statement. Because it's not what people are actually doing, it's what my model suggests people should do. Now, maybe the person doesn't want to retire at 65, right? Which is why I see the data doesn't line up with my theory. Well, then what should I do? Update my theory. But these would be normative statements. They're opinions, right? So normative statements are just opinions. And if you haven't seen the big Lebowski and older movie, you should all watch it. It's hilarious. But this is the differentiation we make between positive and normative statements. We'll kind of tie this into the next thing that I'm going to talk about. So in economics, it's a social science. So it's not biology or chemistry that's rooted in kind of just physical sciences, but it's a study of what individuals are doing. It's still a science. So we will have models that we look at throughout the semester, and these models make certain predictions, right? Our one that we kind of already looked at is that people should choose to buy something or firms should produce something as long as the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost, right? But when we have these models, maybe people aren't actually doing what the model predicts. So we go out and we run an experiment, just like not a chemistry and biology like way back in the day. But I can think about maybe I have some theory about what the combination of these two elements will do based off of chemical structure. I then go run this test and I see, my theory wasn't quite right. When I observed this experiment, it didn't quite line up with my theory. So what do? I go back and update my theory or my model. Now, for economics, most of the time, what is running an experiment? It's actually going out and just collecting data, right? People have kind of already run the experiment for me. They've made purchase decisions. Firms have made production decisions. Although there is an area of economics, and I'll try to get a link up on Canvas just if you're interested. It's called experimental economics, and they run these like experiments in labs, and they usually have people make decisions and then gather the data on that and see, are the decisions made in these like, they call them economic games, right? Are people making decisions that line up with the theory that we have? If they don't, we go back and update our theory. So economics, still a science. We're going to follow the same kind of approach. Now, in these models that we're going to be using throughout the semester, we have this term we say, which is like ceteris paribus. And all these models, right, we're holding all of the things equal. So when I gave you my rent example about the value of a view, what was I saying? That every apartment was exactly the same. The only difference was this one factor. Well, how would the value of view maybe be not quite the same if the structure of the building meant that the rooms that don't have a view are also a little bit smaller? Okay? And so what we're trying to do, we're analyzing the relationship between two variables, the view and how much people are willing to pay. We're holding everything else constant. Now, it's harder to do in the real world, but we have what we call econometric tools that we can use to do this. We're not doing that in this class, but that's how we do this. So we're assuming when we're looking later on at the relationship between prices and the quantity that people buy, we're assuming that we've held constant a lot of other factors, right? We just want to know that relationship between price and how much people are buying. So we want to isolate the effect of one variable on another. Now, I mentioned the models we're looking at, we assume a lot of these other things are constant. That's kind of a simplification, right? We're making these assumptions. Our models are going to be fairly simple. So when we're thinking about testing this with real world data, we can actually go through this scientific process. And I've got an example here. I think I linked the article that kind of had these values, but they went through and said, okay, what's the effect of a college education in terms of how much more money can you expect to make once you guys are out of here? I assume that's why most of you are here, right? Now, once again, my earlier example, it could be more money, could be just a job you like, right? So there's a theory that kind of predicts, looking at some older data, that the returns to a college education, about a 50% increase in your expected salary over your life. Not a lifetime. I think this was year by year, right? So if that's my prediction, right, I then go out and look at the data. So I think I've got the link here in a second. There's a data source from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which collects all this data on workers and finds the average, I think this was weekly salary of someone over 25 is $1,400 approximately. If you only have a high school diploma, the average across all individuals is $850. So I could take a ratio of those two and figure out what that percent increase was. It's not 50%, it's 68. So what do I need to do? I've collected the data. It doesn't line up with my theory. I need to go back and update my theory. So my prediction was wrong. Here's the data source I mentioned. I have to update my theory. Now, this might be a little bit misleading. So I'm going through another example here. When they collected, this is older data. When they collected newer data from 2024, they found almost identical numbers, right? So it was a little bit off. Like rounded the integer here, so it looks like it's still 68%. It was like, the decimal value is off a little bit. But they found the same thing. So their theory must not be that good. Right? They got updated. And maybe it's good because what did I do? I'm looking at means. So if I were out there with a business degree, what do you think the increase or the marginal benefit, the increase in salary that I see is relative to someone who gets a college degree in, I'll pick on my sister here, anthropology. That increase in salary is probably quite a bit. Be stereotypical here. Right? It's not even stereotypical, it's rooted in data. It's low, right? So we know that these different college degrees are going to have different impacts on my expected returns. I've just looked at means across all jobs. Maybe my theory isn't wrong. It just held constant this factor. It wasn't incorporating that maybe different college degrees offer different returns. So that means I need to build a more complex model to kind of explain what I see in the data. So just kind of an example that we can look at some real world data, kind of think about these ideas. And I'll try to sprinkle these in throughout the semester based off of the concept we're talking about. Any questions over this? Keep on out here. My voice is starting to go. Okay. So the next thing that we'll kind of think about, I already mentioned this, but right, I'm just looking at means. Not only maybe will the college degree choice matter, but what else influences my means are just some like outliers, right? If I look at like, Zuckerberg or Gates, maybe they have a college degree, so their returns that it might look like they made billions more. Well, that's one observation out of that. So what we want to do is make sure, and we won't dive too deep into like how we do that. Once again, that's more of like a statistics course, but we are trying to identify causal relationships. When we look at data, a lot of the times we're just going to pick up correlations. Okay? So one of the examples here, if you look at the data in different states or counties, child drowning deaths are highly positively correlated with ice cream sales. So kids are filling up on ice cream, getting to, having that sugar drop and then they're drowning. No, right? Why would both of these things potentially increase? Yeah, well, in some hot weather. Different states and counties have different temperatures, right? So we've not factored in this additional characteristic, right? Our simple correlation is that these things trend in the same direction, but if we somehow could control for the average temperature in an area, that correlation might go away. We kind of know intuitively ice cream sales aren't causing child drowning deaths. So, we haven't factored in this additional variable, right? Now, another maybe a little bit more nuanced example is what's happening, right? If I'm thinking about, I find a negative correlation between the number of hours someone studies and their test performance on an exam, or the grade they get. So studying more makes them do worse on an exam. I've never studied that. So it could be, right? I could control for like when they were studying, right? Maybe those hours had less of an effect. But if I find an overall negative effect, right, it's much more likely, if I'm thinking about this, it's going to be, I would have to have a characteristic that explain why people that get higher grades tend to study at worse time periods. The example I was thinking about was, who has to study more? Someone who doesn't understand it. If you don't understand it, even if you study for 50 hours, you may not do well in the exam, right? The example I use is instead of kind of thinking about hours studying the test scores, so we usually call that like those selection issues. I could go out and I could golf for the next years, right? 50 hours a week. And my performance on a golf course will be terrible. I don't have an innate physical ability for whatever reason. I'm just not good at it. Well, if I wanted to get good, I have to practice a lot. But even though I'm practicing a lot, my hours are going up. What happens? My performance looks like it's negatively correlated because I still don't do well. Whereas maybe someone who's only putting in an hour a week, well, I don't know. I'm not a big golf person. Who's good right now? Shannon. I don't know. Whoever you guys all just said. right? They could put in a lot fewer hours of practicing and their performance is still going to be really high, right? So we haven't been able to kind of capture this like innate ability at something. Test scores and hours studied are the same, right? For example, I could study, biology for forever. I might not be as good. I don't have an innate ability. I'm not able to kind of capture that fact. So a lot of the times in this class, we want to keep in mind, we are trying to analyze the causal effect between two variables. We're going to be looking at somewhat simplistic models, so they may not quite capture causation, right? But we're attempting to do that. We're trying to build in as many factors that move us from just correlation to causation. Okay? Any questions on that idea? Okay. So that ends kind of our module 1 material. So that will be all of the material that you're expected along with the syllabus that we kind of went through on Tuesday. That's what you'll be expected to know and questions will be asked about on that first quiz. Now, if you're thinking about studying for that, yes, use your notes from class, but also these practice problems. They will look very representative of the types of questions you see on that quiz. Now, they don't include syllabus questions here. That's going to be more so like review the slides, maybe read through, skim through that Word document I gave you, kind of identify some of the major points about assignments, due dates, collaborative learning sessions, right? Kind of all those things that I mentioned related to the syllabus or structure of the course. So a little bit less than half that first quiz is syllabus questions, and then the rest of them will be kind of module 1, anything in the reading or what we talked about today. When I say anything in the reading, focus your efforts on what I talk about in class. And I'm likely doing that because that's what I'm going to test you on. Where are we at with time? Okay, perfect. So any other questions before we keep moving here? Yeah. Yeah, they're not assignments. So here, I'll pull them up. I'll pull the answer key up. So when it says .doc or docx, these are just Word documents, right? So you have the questions and the answers available too. And typically after this week, so like for module 2, if you're like, well, how did he get the right answer, right? That's where the CL sessions will kind of work out the intermediate steps for you. Yep. Or we've done examples in class that can kind of help you look at those intermediate steps. Now, when it comes to the quiz, you only get 1 submission. Yep. Any other questions before we keep moving? So just for the sake of where we're at, I want to show you this. So this is how typically these in-class quizzes will work. Today's is not worth any points. To be honest, the reason why is because there's still adds and drops. In fact, this class might get a little bit larger kind of next week. And in fact, the enrollment's already increased by about 20 students this week. So I'll come down here and I'll say, okay, look, today is the 27th. I want to make sure that this is completed by, let's look at time here. $10:35, right? That's what I have the kind of due date set as. I'll come down here. Maybe I go to build. I then usually I'll kind of change this, but depending on how class goes, I want to kind of update this. So I go, okay, it's going to be open for the next 10 minutes, and I will give you an access code. Once again, it's very close to guaranteeing that you're in class. I guess technically you could sit in your dorm room and wait for someone to text you this and have your computer pull up, right? I don't know why you'd go through all that trouble, but technically you could, right? So I'll give you this code, right? I'm then going to go to return here. I'll go back to the main page and I'll publish this quiz, right? I will then give you the next 10 minutes, kind of work on this quiz. And I'll let you guys kind of go off on your own. I'll stay up here. You can talk to the people around you. You may work, probably the best way, efficient way is like work through it first. And then if you want to kind of talk and see, okay, what did you, okay, oh, I did this. What did you do? So it doesn't have to be like completely silent when you're doing these. And that's generally what they will look like when I'm using them in class. So you can kind of see right here, I'm not using at the very end of class, right? Sometimes I do. Sometimes I'll even use them to kind of, if I know that it's really important that we understand what's happening on Tuesday's class, or I think we might need a refresher, sometimes I'll start them out towards the beginning. So get into that quiz, all right? So you can kind of test and make sure everything's working. I've got it set to be 0 points, so it's not worth any points, but just to make sure we're set up well for next week. And then usually you can see it in front of you, where I typically will do, and maybe I'll hide my screen in class so that you can't see the answers ahead of time, but I'll go to this preview mode. I'll make sure they're up here on the board. You would then take the next 5-10 minutes to answer. So if you want to answer these, you can. I would appreciate it if you do. I know most of you are freshmen, but some of my sections are a little bit different. So I just kind of asked, like, what level of student are you consider at the university? And I don't know, how is IU football going to do? Are they going to win the national championship again? So just get on, get these submitted. Make sure you can have these quizzes working on whatever device that you're using. So I know sometimes there might be like some compatibility issues with tablets. So make sure you're able, and if you want to use your phone, make sure it's working on your phone as well. Okay. And there's no right or wrong. It's not for any points. I'm just using this to make sure we have it working for next week. So next week on Tuesday, we will have an in-class quiz that counts.
And you said those are normally like 23.
Huh?
You said those are normally like 12 weeks.
So the in-class quizzes, excuse me, each one is worth 4 points. You'll simply get credit for answering the question, half of it, and then the other half will be for answering the question. The weekly quizzes, those are worth 12. Typically 12 questions, maybe a few more, maybe a few less, or harder questions I might put smaller points.
I'm grand.
So, all right. So make sure, it's not worth any points. Make sure it's working. We'll kind of start with these next Tuesday. Okay. One other thing I want to mention here that I failed to earlier is I'm going to have these weekly quizzes. So this was an in-class quiz. The weekly quizzes will have a lockdown browser shown them. So what that means is whatever device you're using, hopefully it's a computer, it'll lock you out of all of the web pages and other programs. So this is my attempt to not have to use generative AI on these, right? So what's important if you can't access other web pages or files, if you want to have like your notes and you write them down in like, I don't know, where you're writing them down on a program so that you can, instead of like physically on paper, print those out, right? If you want to access them, make sure that you can, you have access to the notes. It's just, it'll lock you out of them, accessing them on your computer. So print them out. You have written notes, obviously you can have those in front of you. If you're taking a laptop, you can still have like the module reading, or you can look at the slides on that device. It's just kind of make it so it's a little bit more difficult to like use these generative AI tools, right? Also, you probably should get used to these lockdown browsers for the courses you're going to be taking moving forward. Right? In fact, if you take like a summer or online course, you'll start to see professors using even more restrictive. Right? So I'm just kind of introducing it to you here, and we'll be using it for all of the weekly quizzes. All right, so we've got about, 20 minutes left. So I figured we'd get through Module 1 material a little bit quicker, and I want to make sure we have a little more time for Module 2 next week so that we aren't like rushing through it. And I know we're starting out, so I want to make sure the early principles are really understanding them. Because what did I say on Tuesday? This class just continues to build. Okay? So I've put up kind of the slides for next week, but we'll kind of dive into them a little bit here. So forgot to open them up. Have these start here. So we're going to start out with an example where, and this is the most macroeconomics we'll probably get the entire semester. Okay. So let's assume I have an economy, all right? It could be a country, state, whatever. And they have a certain number of limited resources. So they face these limited resources. They have to start making decisions facing them. So they have, I'll simplify this, they can produce two types of goods. You'll see models that are built like this. They don't give specific goods like computers and wheat like I did here, but generally be like technology goods or kind of non-technology goods, right? So I've got a certain number of labor hours. I can start to put my workers, their hours towards the production of these two goods. This could be a firm. Maybe I have a production facility and I can produce simultaneously hats, shirts, pants. I'm choosing what workers I want to put in which divisions. Okay? So let's say that I've got every computer I produce requires 10 labor hours, and every computer I produce costs me 100 labor hours, and every, we'll say the unit is tons of wheat, costs me 10. Okay? So if I wanted to think about, if I put all of my labor towards the production of computers, well, if each computer requires 100 labor hours, I have 50,000 total. Divide 50,000 by 100, I can produce 500 total computers. I'm not producing any wheat. I could then start to think about, okay, well, if my people can't eat, it doesn't matter that I have all these computers, right? It's not a very sustainable economy. So we started to think about what are some other combinations of these two goods I could produce. Well, if I put 40,000 of my labor hours towards computer production, I can get 400 computers. But now if I take 10,000 of those labor hours, put them towards wheat production, divide that by 10, right? I can get 1,000 tons of wheat. I could then kind of work through all of the different combinations. Now here I only gave you 5, right? But we could have much more continuous. I could like produce just one more ton of wheat, and I could get to like the decimal form if I really wanted to. In the examples you'll see, I'll do something like this where I just give you 5, 6, 7, 8 things, right? Kind of keep it a little bit smaller number. Were you guys able to get those slides pulled up? I see some. Okay, I saw some people doing some things that I was kind of worried. Some confused looks in them. So here's all the combinations of these two goods that I can produce. So I'll then want to kind of start thinking about how could I graph these? There we go. Nope, what this? Okay. So I want to make sure I'm getting these values correct. So let's say I think about graphing these. And just for now, let's say I want to put the number of, or the quantity, I usually write kind of Q as this shorthanding quantity, or the number of computers my economy is producing. And then up here, I'm going to put kind of the quantity of wheat, or the number of tons of wheat that my economy is producing. So here I'm not worrying about the labor hours. That's where my quantities came from. When we're talking about this production possibilities curve, or if you Google search, you might see it called the production possibilities frontier. Anything I do, I always kind of call it the PPC or the production possibilities curve. They're just two terms that mean the same thing. Okay. So if I was only producing wheat, if we look back at that table, I think I could produce 5,000, but I'm producing no computers. Right? If I instead then start taking my labor force and divert some of the people who are producing wheat, I go down to 4,000 tons, and I put those labor hours towards computer production, then I could get this combination of 1,000 computers. Sorry, no, what did I have here? Yeah, no, this is right. 4,000 tons of wheat and 100 computers. I could then go through, kind of graph the rest of these. So I had what, like 2,500, 250, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the maximum point here, if I'm only producing computers, we were at 500. So I only gave you 5 points. In practice, obviously, we can produce like any combination in between. So if I wanted like a more continuous graph, sorry, this one was supposed to be on there. I missed it a little bit. We would kind of have this line. This is what this line represents, all the combinations if we're using all of our resources, all of our labor hours. These are the different combinations of these two goods my economy could produce. Right? So any point that's on this curve, right? So I'll call this kind of A. We would say these points are what we would call production efficient, right? They're efficient because I'm using all of my resources. I'm not just letting some of them lay there and waste. So any point on this production possibilities curve, we say is production efficient. I'm using all of the available resources to me to produce. And in practice, it's not just two goods. Like we know economies produce, I don't know, millions of, I don't know how many goods there are, right? But a lot. Okay. It's just that we can visualize two goods. If I wanted to do like 3, I'd have a 3-dimensional graph and then et cetera, et cetera. I can't even visualize it. I have to, look at vectors and stuff that's not fun, right? So we'll only ever keep these examples to two goods. So I'm thinking about this here. What if I had a point out here? In fact, let me make this a little bit more. Let's say the point was out here. Well, if I was producing 2,500 tons of wheat, I said using all of my labor hours, I could only produce 250 computers. Can I produce, keeping that amount of wheat the same, can I produce more computers? No, I've already used all of my labor hours or all of my resources. So we would call these points that are like past this production possibilities curve. We would say these points are unattainable. I don't have enough resources to kind of produce that combination of these two goods. Any questions on that idea? Yeah. We'll come back to that in a second. It's a good question. You're thinking ahead here. Yep. Any other questions on this idea? What about a point that was down here? Call this point C. All right. What would be true about point C? We would say it's inefficient or production is efficient because any point below that curve means that I'm not using all of my resources, right? You could think about it. Maybe there's another point like here. I'm producing the same amount of wheat. I could be producing more computers, but I'm not. I'm being production inefficient. I'm not using all of my resources. So we'll think about any point on this. I shouldn't smile. I'm sorry that happened. So any point on that curve is production efficient. Any point past it, unattainable. Any point below it, production inefficient. Okay. So these are kind of our three ranges, so to speak. Okay. Any questions here before we add some things in? Yep. Why is that? So it's production efficient. When we say production efficient, it just means I'm using all of my resources to produce these goods. Next class, I'll introduce an idea. What point on that curve do we want to produce at? That term will be what we call allocatively efficient. We won't get into that today. Kind of studying and stuff to be able to talk about that next week. Yep. Any other questions here? Okay. So facing this production possibilities curve, one thing that this will tell us, or we might be interested in, is what is the cost of one more computer? Well, if you go back to those numbers, if every computer costs me 100 labor hours and every ton of wheat costs me 10, to get one more computer, I have to give up 10 tons of wheat, right? How could I determine that from this graph? Well, essentially, it's going to be what is the change, right, in my wheat production over the change in my computer production, or what is on my y-axis? Wheat. What was on my x-axis? Computers. So all I would be doing is looking for the slope of this curve, and it should tell me the cost of computers or my x-axis good. Okay. So if I went through this process, and let's just say I move, the easiest points are between these two extremes, right? But I won't use it. I'll do this one actually. Let's say I move from this point to this point. How much did my wheat production change by? It went down by 1,000. How much did my computer production increase by? Went up by 100. So what was my cost of one computer, or what was my slope? I have a negative sign here because costs are always negative, but it would represent the cost of one more computer is 10 what? Tons of wheat, or however much of the other good I have to give up to get one more unit of that x-axis good. So that's how we can start to use these production possibilities curves to determine the costs of production. for one of these goods. Okay. Any questions on that idea? Now, I'll revisit this at the beginning of next class, but you could think about, what if I instead wanted to know the cost of one more ton of wheat? Well, I know the cost of a computer. If I wanted to produce another ton of wheat, I know every kind of labor hour, every ton of wheat costs me 10 labor hours. Every computer is 100, right? Get one more unit of wheat, I'd have to give up a 10 over 100 tenth of a computer. That seems goofy in this example, but that's the cost of one more ton of wheat, right? So what's going to end up being true is the cost of my y-axis good is actually going to end up being not the slope of my production possibilities curve, but 1 over that slope. Okay. Now, I'll give you, or in this case, sorry, 1/10 of a computer. Now, I'll give you a little bit more insight as to why that's true. If I can get my paper to stay here. So if I'm telling you, and we can kind of see that the slope is the cost of my x-axis good, instead of having to remember that, oh yeah, the cost of my y-axis good is 1 over the slope, what could I do? I could flip what good I put on my x-axis, right? So I could put computers on the y-axis, wheat on my x-axis. That's the reverse of what I did here. I could then think about, okay, the quantity of computers, those extreme points were 500 and 0 and 5,000 and 0. Here was my production possibilities curve. If I determine the slope here, once again, change in y over change in x. What's on my y-axis? Computers. So they went from 500 to 0, negative 500. How much did my x-axis good change by? It went from 0 to 5,000. Sure enough, what do I get here? Sorry, that's not what I get. I get my new slope is negative 1/10, which is the same thing. If I didn't go through this process of switching the goods, I could just take 1 over the slope or 1 over the cost of my x-axis good. That always tells me the cost of my y-axis good. But technically, I could go through this process where I flip them, and now my slope tells me the cost of my new x-axis good. So if it's easier to, instead of redrawing it out, you can remember this rule that the cost of your y-axis good is 1 over the slope. Any questions on this idea? Okay. So we'll revisit this idea next class. I just want to do one more thing just to kind of get us thinking about what we'll be doing on Tuesday. Let's say I go back to my original example. How could I get to point B? If I have new technology and the same number of labor hours, the same workers become more effective. Or if my population grows, what will that do? It'll make the combination of these two goods I can produce higher at every point, shifts out my production possibilities curve, hopefully so that that point now becomes production efficient, right? But the only way we get that is if there's a change. So back to my earlier discussion, we're looking at this relationship between the production of two goods. If I produce more of this good, how much less of the other good am I producing? I held constant a lot of other factors. What if one of those other factors changed? New technology, my workers become more efficient, like generative AI. Or if I just have more workers available in my economy. So that's what we'll kind of dive into at the beginning of Tuesday's class. Before I let you out of here, just as kind of a reminder, helps me out if you fill out that collaborative learning poll. Module reading, first quiz, and it's module 2's reading, due at the end of the day on Monday. Okay. So have a fun, safe weekend. I will see you guys on Tuesday.